everybody, it's Janet, and this is our third lecture in marine ecology. And we've already talked a little bit about what ecology is, the idea that it includes both the abiotic or non-living and biotic or living parts of ecosystems and how they interact with one another, how they influence one another. Today we're going to be looking at a case study in marine ecology from the kelp forest habitat, and this will be our last lecture in marine ecology. So it'll be nice to see how this gets applied. So what's a kelp forest? Kelp is a type of seaweed, so it's part of the chromista. And if we look down here at the bottom right, we have a map of where kelp forests are found in the world. And we have them here in the United States. Now, these guys over here on the East Coast, these are laminaria forests. And laminaria are relatively small kelps. We have large, giant kelp forests out on the Pacific Northwest, and that's what we're going to be talking about, are the giant kelps, all right? So this is what an individual kelp plant looks like, and this is what a kelp forest looks like. Now the bottom of kelp is attached to the bottom, but the top of it has floats, so the plant itself will float and stand upright, and so they kind of look like forests. Looks like a forest of trees, except that those trees are kelp. So the kelp that we have in the Pacific Northwest, we have two different species. We have giant kelp here on the left, and we have bull kelp on the right here. Right? So they look different, but they have similar qualities to them. And let's talk about what makes up a kelp. So the first thing you should know is that they are held down by something called a holdfast. And we have sort of what they look like on the whole organism here, and then up here on the right hand side, this is a picture of a holdfast. You can see it kind of looks like roots, except that when kelp attach themselves to the bottom, these holdfasts don't go down into the bottom. Rather, they attach onto things like rocks. They need to attach onto solid substrate. So these basically will surround a rock or something solid, and they're very, very sticky. So they hold this kelp in place. They hold it fast, which is why it's called a holdfast, all right? So that's the bottom of the kelp. And then going back over here to our kelp diagram, we have the stipe, and that's sort of like the stem or the trunk of a tree, right? We then have blades. These blades are somewhat similar to leaves. They're designed to photosynthesize, so they're broad and flat so they can capture as much sunlight as possible. And then one of the interesting things about kelp is that they have air bladders, and this is what those air bladders look like. They're filled with gas, and this is what causes the kelp to stand upright, because these bladders will float and they'll pull the plant upright. So this is how they act like kelp forests. This is why they stand upright. And giant kelp are very, very tall. They're like 30 or 40 feet tall, all right? So they can grow all the way from the bottom until they're actually at the very, very surface. So these individual kelps really do act kind of like trees do in forests. Now, kelp forests need to have cold, nutrient-rich water, and there's plenty of that in the Pacific Northwest. They're also limited in depth, so they don't want to be too shallow because there'll be too much wave action there. There'll be too many breaking waves there, and that's too much turbulence. They also don't want to be too deep because they need to have sufficient sun for growth. If they go too deep into the ocean, they can't photosynthesize. So these are typically found between 50 and 130 feet of depth. Just like a forest provides habitat for things like squirrels or birds or raccoons or things like that, kelp forests provide habitat for marine organisms, and they actually host a huge diversity of organisms. They're one of the most diverse habitats in the ocean. So they're a very, very interesting habitat. Let's take a look and see what these look like.
Kelp forests can be seen along much of the west coast of North America. Kelp are actually large brown algae that live in cool, relatively shallow waters close to the shore. They grow in dense groupings, much like a forest on land. These underwater towers of kelp provide food and shelter for thousands of fish, invertebrate, and marine mammal species. Kelp are very simple organisms that consist of a holdfast, a stipe, and blades. At the bottom is a root-like structure called a holdfast that anchors kelp to rocks and other materials on the ocean floor. Young kelp must compete for space to settle and grow, as the rocky bottom is carpeted with smaller algae and invertebrates like anemones and sponges. The stipe is similar to a plant's stem. It is strong, yet flexible, allowing kelp to sway in the currents of the ocean. Many fish use this middle area of the kelp forest as hunting grounds. The blades contain a special gas which act like a float, keeping the kelp blades close to the surface of the water where they absorb energy from the sun. This ability to float raises the kelp to the sea surface, forming a dense canopy. The canopy serves as a nursery or brood area for many organisms due to the warmer surface temperatures and slower water currents. Many organisms, from small fish to birds and even whales, use the thick blades as a safe shelter for their young from predators or even rough storms. Kelp forests have a greater variety and higher diversity of plants and animals than almost any other ocean community. NOAA scientists study kelp forests by visiting the same locations over and over to assess the presence and abundance of a variety of organisms. Monitoring allows marine scientists to determine if the kelp forest is changing over time and to identify the cause of those changes, whether natural or human. Healthy kelp forests maintain the existence of thousands of plants and animals, fish stocks, and many ocean and tourism-based businesses. All of these require a thriving ocean ecosystem. We all depend on the ocean for food, oxygen, and even life-saving pharmaceuticals. Do your part to keep our ocean and local waterways clean, litter-free, and healthy.
All right, so that's a look at what kelp forests look like when you're scuba diving under the surface. Now let's talk about some of the residents of kelp forests. So kelp is sort of the bottom of the food chain. It is the primary producer. It photosynthesizes, so it captures energy from the sun and turns it into sugars, and those sugars allow the organism to make other substances as well. But above that, we have herbivores, and this is one of the herbivores that you find in kelp forests. This is a Pacific purple sea urchin, all right? And these are herbivores, so they eat plants. And this is their mouth. They have 5 razor-sharp teeth. They actually have the most complex mouth of the animal kingdom. And it has its own name. It's called Aristotle's lantern. And these guys are pretty voracious eaters. And if they go unchecked, they will eat kelp down to where it completely disappears. When you have a large number of sea urchins, they'll eat all of the kelp. And when you see something like this is called an urchin baron because they've eaten away all of the kelp. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it looks like when they start to eat things.
Urchins are grazers, munching their way through submarine pastures of plants and algae, and they do it in slow motion. Along the California coast, urchins can reach plague proportions. They have a voracious appetite for giant kelp. These emerald forests, lush citadels of life, are defenseless before the slow and steady urchin army. Seen in time-lapse, urchins spring into eerie life, devouring anything edible in their path. Urchins don't have eyes, so they can't see where they're going. But they do have sensory tube feet, which wave to and fro, tasting the water for anything good to eat. Their versatile tube feet not only carry them over the subterranean plains, they can even snag drifting bits of kelp. The feet act like a bucket brigade, passing the food from one sticky sucker to the next, pulling the meal relentlessly toward the powerful, star-shaped jaw that awaits underneath. The sheer force of its 5 razor-sharp teeth can shatter a grain of sand. It makes short work of the tender kelp, neatly scissoring it into bite-sized pieces. To us, they may appear to be curiosities, resting motionless on the kelp, but they are actually gorging themselves. Although they eat so slowly, we must speed up the action to see it clearly. An uncontrolled urchin population can have a devastating impact over time. Every hour, a lettuce-sized piece of kelp can disappear down those star-shaped jaws. When urchin populations are high, the persistent nibbling of their armies can mow down an entire kelp forest within a matter of months.
So that's the next level up in this food chain. When there are a lot of urchins, we end up with these these urchin barrens where we have all of the kelp eaten. That's because herbivory pressure is very, very high. But luckily, urchins aren't the top of the food chain. We have other organisms in the kelp forest that like to eat purple sea urchins. So these are sea otters. They are found only in kelp forests, and look how cute they are, right? They typically float on the surface when they're feeding. They can swim below the surface, but they need to come to the surface to breathe. They're air breathers because they're mammals. And they will basically go below, they'll swim below, capture their prey, come up to the surface and eat it. They also like to wrap themselves in kelp. See how they're all holding on to a frond of kelp, and they're doing that so they don't get washed away by currents, all right? So here they are, and if we look up here in the upper right, this otter is eating a purple sea urchin. And let's just look and see what that looks like when they feed on purple sea urchins. Okay. Sorry. Stop playing. There we go. All right. So this is the next level up in the food chain. So we had the primary producers, the photosynthesizers, which were the kelp. We had the herbivores, which were the purple sea urchins. And now we have carnivores above that, which are our sea otters. So this is what a simple food chain might look like if we're thinking about the kelp forest, where we have kelp at the bottom, we have sea urchins feeding on the kelp, and then we have sea otters feeding on the sea urchins. Now, what would happen if otters disappeared? That's what I want you to think about here. So if all these otters here disappeared for some reason, they got sick or they were hunted or they got swept away or something like that. If these disappeared, if they stopped feeding on purple sea urchins, what do you think would happen to the population of sea urchins? Do you think that would go down or do you think it would go up? If sea otter populations go down, what we find is that the grazing pressure, the foraging pressure on sea urchins goes down, and therefore their population goes up. Now, if sea urchin populations go up, what do you think happens to the population of kelp? If there's more sea urchins, what happens to kelp? So if you have more sea urchins, grazing pressure is higher, foraging pressure is higher, and what we see is that kelp biomass goes down. So what we find here is that we have, if you change the top level of this food chain, not only does the next level change, but the level beyond that changes. And you could imagine that you'd have even changes beyond that because these kelp provide habitat for a wide diversity of organisms. If the kelp is gone, then those organisms don't have any habitat and they die as well. All right, so this is what happens when otters disappear. So with sea otters, we find healthy kelp beds, healthy kelp forests that look like this. But without sea urchins or sea otters, we see urchin barrens just like this. Now, we've seen this over time. Lots of data have been collected on this. And these data, I apologize for how unclear this figure is coming out, but let's take a look at what this says. Now, look at the x-axis. This is time, and it's 100 years from 1910 to 2010. We have an abundance index on the y-axis, which basically tells us how many of something there are. And then we have two lines that are graphed. So this line here, this is the number of urchins. So it has white, open white circles. And then we have this line here. This is the amount of kelp. This line has dark black circles. All right. So in 1910, there were a lot of urchins. All right. They were very abundant, but there was not very much kelp. All right. So 1910, lots of urchins, not very much kelp, and that makes sense. So in 1910, otters were very, very rare. In fact, for the first half of the 1900s, otters were rare, and that's because when Europeans and Russians first came to the Americas, they hunted otters and they trapped otters because otters have a very, very thick coat. Their coat is not only thick, but it also traps air in it, and so it's waterproof. So it's a really it's a nice coat, and they would hunt these so that they could make clothing out of them. So these were very, very rare in the first half of the 1900s. And so if you have not very many otters, then you have a lot of sea urchins, like right over here in 1910, and not very much kelp. Now, about the middle of the 19th century, otters became protected. So laws were made to protect their population. And when that happened, otters became more abundant. So we can see up here, the top of our graph, they're showing us that otters are more abundant from about 1960 to about 1990. All right, and there's bigger arrows here indicating that their populations were really healthy in the 70s and 80s. All right. When that happens, when we have otters become abundant, look at what happens to the number of sea urchins. The sea urchin abundance plummets, right? And look at what happens to kelp. When we have a lot of otters and not a lot of urchins, our kelp forests become healthier and their abundance goes up, all right? So that's what happened starting in the early 1900s and in the late 1900s. But then you'll notice around 1990, otters become less abundant. And when that happens, and in fact, they become rare, when that happens, urchin populations go back up like this, and kelp populations once again go down. All right, so we're seeing this, this sort of seesaw effect in the food chain over a course of 100 years. Now, why would otters become less abundant in the 1990s, even after they were protected? Let's take a look at this figure over here on the left. So all the way over here, this is the traditional food chain where we have otters that are heavily controlling. See this big arrow? That means it's a heavy control. Otters are heavily controlling the population of urchins, and because of that, urchins have very little control over the population of kelp. But in the 1990s, the theory is that, well, we know that orcas started to feed very heavily on otters. And the theory of that is that the killer whales, their traditional prey, such as seals and sea lions, were becoming less and less abundant. So they turned to otters. Now, otters are okay food, but they're not orca's favorite food because they're small. They don't have a lot of lipids in them, so they're not a great food for orcas. But if there's nothing else to eat, they will turn to them and eat them. So what we see is a change in our food web, all right? And we see this in the data that they present here. So we have down for all of these, the x-axis is time, and we have 4 different things they're measuring. The first one is otter abundance, all right? And we can see this is percent of the maximum ever counted. So we can see that starting in about 1990, population of otters plummeted, right? So otter population went down. We can also see that sea urchin biomass back in the 80s was very low, but in 1997 was very, very high. And that means that grazing intensity, well, that started out as very, very low, and that went up, so it's very, very high. And then we had just the opposite thing happen with kelp. In the mid-80s, there were a lot of kelp, and then in 1997, we saw less kelp, much less kelp, all right? So we're seeing again this seesawing, but it's because we have another chain at the top of the food chain. We added another layer to the top of the food chain. So we can see that over here we have a strong arrow between otters and sea urchins. But when we add this and we have a strong arrow, strong influence, strong pressure from orca to sea lion, then this arrow becomes small because the pressure, the foraging pressure, the control from otters over sea urchins, it changes and it becomes weak. And that means that sea urchins have a strong control over kelp. When we have something like this happen, where you have a change at the top, which then affects all the things below it, this is called a trophic cascade. The word cascade is sort of like waterfall. So you have a change that is cascading through the food chain. All right. It means you have a change in one level of the food web that affects other levels. All right. And it affects not just the one below it, but even the one below that. And it could go on and on and on. All right. So when this happens, we have a change in energy flow. We can have a change in community ecology. And this would create a big change in community ecology. A community, an ecological community, is sort of the collection of all of the living organisms. So you can change that collection. That collection might have a lot of species A, and then after a trophic cascade would have only a small amount of species A. Trophic cascades can be top down, and this example is a great top down example where you have changes at the top trickle down the food chain, but you also can have bottom up, and a great example of that would be if you were to add nutrients to the plants at the bottom of a food chain, that change could trickle up. So you could have changes at the bottom that affect things at the top. All right, so this is a trophic cascade. And there are a lot of examples of trophic cascades in the study of ecology. So on our left, we have an example that is from Yellowstone National Park. So Yellowstone for many, many years had all of the wolves that were there, they had been extirpated. So they had been removed through hunting and trapping. And when there are no wolves, you have a lot of elk. Not only do you have higher numbers of elk, but elk their behavior changes when they're no longer afraid of predators. They don't have to be stealthy. They can kind of do whatever they want. They don't have to look around and worry about wolves. So you have when you have a lot of elk who are kind of doing whatever they want, they eat a lot of these willows and aspens. So they eat a lot of woody plants. So the forest is kind of sparse, right? So when you have a trophic cascade in Yellowstone National Park, they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone National Park. All right, and when you reintroduce wolves, not only do they prey directly on elk, meaning the numbers are smaller, but those elk also have to behave more stealthily. They have to be more careful. They don't have as much time to devote to foraging because they have to look around for predators. And so that means that forests are changing there. Aspens and willows are increasing. Their biomass is increasing. And the theory here is that this is a trophic cascade that has occurred. So that's one example. We have another example here in this study. And in this study, this is actually a really clever study because these authors, they manipulated four different habitats. And in those habitats, these are in rocky intertidal habitats. One of them they just left alone. It was the control. But in the other three, they either had only small green crabs, and we've talked about green crabs before, how they're voracious predators. So in one of their ecosystems, they only had small green crabs, and in another one, they had only medium, and in another one, they only had large green crabs. And they took a look at what happened to the ecology of that habitat over time. So what they found is that if you have small green crabs, then you have more fish because these guys will feed on fish. And you will then have less grazers. So these are grazers. These are little amphipods, and these are something called ostracods, and they will graze directly on microalgae. So if you have small green crabs, you have less pressure on fish, and that means you have more pressure on grazers, and that means you have less pressure on microalgae. So you have more microalgae. So small crabs means more microalgae. But when you talk about the the part of the study that only had large green crabs, well, they had more pressure on fish. That meant there weren't a lot of fish around to eat the grazers, so there were more grazers, and that meant that there was less microalgae. So this is a trophic cascade that's happening not only because you have more numbers of green crabs, but just different sizes of green crabs. That can cause a trophic cascade. All right, now we're going to look at a trophic cascade that occurred in the Pacific Northwest. And this trophic cascade gave us the idea that there can be keystone species in a habitat. So this guy over here, this is Bob Payne, and he started his study as an ecologist in the 1960s. This is him in the 60s, and this is him in modern times. So time has passed here. And he's a very famous ecologist because his work is really foundational. It's one of the most important things that we've learned about ecosystems. This is the idea that we have keystone species. So when he arrived in the Pacific Northwest, he was very interested in the rocky intertidal, and we've talked about the rocky intertidal before. Let's look at this. This is a model of the rocky intertidal. Let's say this is the bottom of the rocky intertidal, and there's a lot of water covering this because of course the tide goes up and goes down, but down here it's wetter because the tide is over it more often. So up here it's warmer and drier, right? So we see different species at the top and the bottom because some species are better acclimated to, they're better adapted to being dry and warm. And then we have different species down here because they're better competitors, and they live down here. Now, not only do we have better competitors, but we typically have more predators at the bottom of the rocky intertidal. Typically, predators can't get all the way up to where it is hot and dry. They're not good at dealing with that. Now, the predators in his experiment were these sea stars. These are called Peisaster. Okay, and you can see that in a natural state, you have a lot of these sea stars down here and not very many of them up here. Now, these are voracious predators and they will eat all sorts of things, but they especially love to eat these blue mussels. All right. So this is what is naturally occurring. So what Bob Payne did is he took two different parts of the rocky intertidal, and in one of them he just left it alone. So that was his control. All right. And then he took another part and he went and he removed all of the sea stars. All right. And he asked the question, well, what happens if I remove all of these sea stars? What happens to the community ecology of the rocky intertidal if I take this top predator away? He took them all away and he kept them all away for 10 years. So he started to do this in 1963, and he would go out there on a regular basis and he would remove any sea stars he found in his experimental plot. So let's look at what happened over time. On our x-axis, we have time, and on our y-axis, we have the number of species present. Another word for this, another word that we use to describe the number of species present or the diversity of species is richness, okay? Species richness. So here we have the number of species that are found in his plots. And the black is the plot he left alone, and the red is the plot that he took the sea stars away. And you can see that they started out with about the same diversity, but then over time, the plot where he took away the sea star plummeted. So that meant that it started out with a lot of species, and then very quickly, over the course of 3 years, it lost its species diversity. Right? It's down here where there's only, 2 or 3 species. And even here in 1971, gosh, there's only like 1 species present that he measured. All right. So this change wasn't just a one-shot thing. It persisted over the course of his study. So what he saw when he took away these sea stars, he saw that mussels took over everything. Before, there were only some mussels, and they were only at the very top of the rocky intertidal. But when you took away their predator, the sea star, they moved down and they outcompeted everything. So they outcompeted barnacles, they outcompeted the gooseneck barnacles, they outcompeted the rockweed, and they became the dominant species, so dominant that sometimes they were the only thing there. So Bob Payne came up with this idea that you can have species that might be low in number in an ecosystem, but their influence on the ecosystem is very, very large. And so we call these a keystone species. And he considered Piesaster, these are Piesaster right here, this is what they actually look like. He considered Piesaster to be keystone species because if you take away these keystone species, you have huge changes in the ecosystem. You have all sorts of trophic cascades occurring, and you have competition changing, and you have just enormous change, all right? So this is one example of a keystone species. And we also consider sea otters to be a type of keystone species as well, because if you take away sea otters, then you end up with a lot of urchins, you don't have any kelp, and then all of those species that rely on kelp for their habitat go away. All right, so diversity changes enormously if otters are not present. A couple of other examples, we have beavers, and beavers are considered keystone species because they build dams, and when they build dams, they create ponds, and those ponds are important habitat for all sorts of species, so they're a keystone species. And then we also have American gators. These gators will create moist or wet pits, basically. They'll dig pits, and those become important habitat for all sorts of species. All right, so these are keystone species. All right, we're going to finish up here by taking a look at a video about keystone species and about Bob Payne's work and what he did out there in the Pacific Northwest.
On the rocky shores of Washington State lives a storied collection of invertebrates, an orgasmic explosion of biotic design. On the rocks, life of every color and kind, like Middleus, the mussel, old Balanus aside, or chitons and limpets that eat where they hide. A plethora of producers, algae, red, brown, and green, near nudies that munch sponges while anemones sting, attached in every conceivable way by glues, threads, and phalli in a fight to hold space. And atop of this banquet, the predators rise, dashing about between Pacific tides. Hungry dog whelks roaming the seashore in packs, drilling for delectable sessile snacks, while the sea star, Pisaster, oozes digestive slime, dissolving dozens of barnacles all at one time, or stalking another of its favorite treats, a bite. No, a banquet of Middleus meat. Such was the scene when from the plains of Mitch, Payne arrived and observed a true naturalist niche. And straightway he wondered, like any good ecologist might, what keeps the diversity so high at this site? If a place to attach is all that's required, what keeps these species together, all of them mired in a constant struggle to take over the space? What keeps the best one from winning first place? And the more that he watched and the more that he wondered, the more that he thought about sea stars that blundered around, blindly consuming all in their wake, he mused, was it they who were clearing out space so that no species could manage to exclude the others? So he went back to his lab and mustered his druthers and decided to do an experiment to suss out just what the predation meant, because what others had said now seemed not to be true, that predators could cause the prey types to be few. Gathered his transects and his quadrat frame, and he marked off 2 patches in Macaw Bay. In one, he pried up every last stubborn Pisaster, employing a crowbar to dislodge those rock-hugging masters. This prince of the predators now tossed out to sea. Thus Payne left this first patch top predator free. The other patch he left unmolested, so the tube-footed menace was here uncontested. Then, for 3 years, he counted every spat, shell, and settler, every new recruit, every passing meddler. And between the 2 patches a pattern emerged. Without sea stars, soon there was a barnacle scourge. But months after all the bare space became naught, mussels began settling every crack in the rock. More mussels settled and grew every day. Soon the limpets picked up their shells and skirted away, and the barnacles all got smothered and died. The algae that settled washed away with the tide, and over time richness dropped from 15 to 8, and the patch soon succumbed to its mussely fate. But the other patch chugged along in its unaltered habit, a mosaic of colonies of this kind or that. It kept constantly shifting as the Pisasters hunted and picked off whichever of them got too abundant. And Payne persevered on into the 70s to see if this pattern would ever be remedied. But even after a decade, the story remained. The simple loss of the sea star made diversity wane. And so, 2 ideas were made very clear, both important enough to last 45 years. 1. When predator preference has density dependence, predators can mediate prey coexistence. And 2. Some species, though in number be few, just by doing whatever they do, can change the fate of many other species who may or may not be directly connected, but by cascading links are significantly affected, such that this singular species, all on its own, forms a sort of biological keystone, keeping the arch of the community as we know it in place, enabling a diversity of critters to share the same space.
All right, so that is the end of our discussions about marine ecology. And oh, isn't this a cute? I know, he's super cute, isn't he? Next week, we're going to start talking about biological productivity, and I just want to encourage you guys to stay positive and to make sure that you're socially isolating, stay at home, wash your hands, all right? Keep yourself safe, keep your family safe, keep your community safe. I look forward to talking to you again, and I hope you all are doing well. Thanks a lot, guys.